Hello and welcome back to this downful idealistic crusade. In this video, I'm going to be talking about Ian Fleming's, it's technically a work of nonfiction, but it's being written as if it were a fictional novel. And that's 1957's The Diamond Smugglers, which is very much tied to the previous year's Diamonds Are Forever, his fourth James Bond novel. In his usual exhaustive research for that novel, Fleming was eventually introduced to Sir Percy Sillitoe, who was formerly the head of MI5 and was now in charge of the International Diamond Security Organization, tasked with essentially routing out and putting an end to the diamond smuggling trade. So Fleming was able to get all kinds of first-hand information, which he then used in his novel, as he always did. After this point, Sillitoe had suggested to the Sunday Times that they do some articles about the IDSO's attempts to end the diamond smuggling trade, and the Sunday Times approached Fleming to write the articles. Essentially, what was then done was that Fleming had a period of 2 weeks where he conducted intensive interviews with the deputy of the IDSO, John Collard, who was actually a World War II commando and had been in MI5 under Sillitoe, and then joined him in the International Diamond Security Organization. And so he basically gave Fleming extraordinarily detailed accounts of various incidents of diamond smuggling and various individuals who got involved in the smuggling pipelines. And of course, Fleming honed in on every salacious detail and then was able to use his marvelous writing style to really give these stories life, but having to fictionalize certain things like the various names involved. So all the stories contained are real, just some of the actual names and dates have been fictionalized a bit from the actual historical events. But Collard himself was given a different nom de plume in the book, and the book itself was essentially compiled out of the serialized articles that were published first in the Sunday Times. So the book is basically a collection of these serialized pieces that are Fleming using his amazing writing style to give just a very slightly fictionalized version of true events of diamond smuggling in Africa and the IDSO's attempts to put an end to it. And when you read it in novel form, it still reads perfectly as a standalone book, but it's helpful to know how the whole project came to be. Now, the actual reading experience is actually quite similar to one of Fleming's Bond novels, and that's why I think it's important. If you're going to read all of Fleming, you do need to read his two non-Bond adult works, and The Diamond Smugglers is basically adjacent to Diamonds Are Forever. It came out between Diamonds and From Russia with Love, but it also actually has direct connections and even quotes elements of the Diamonds Are Forever novel, and basically grew out of the connections Fleming had made during his intensive research project for that book. So if you're reading the books chronologically, I think you need to slot in The Diamond Smugglers between Diamonds Are Forever and From Russia with Love, because that's the time Fleming wrote it, and also that was when it was actually published in terms of coming out between the two books. So I think it's an important sort of stepping stone between the two, and also shows Fleming trying some different things, which he would really do in From Russia with Love to shake up his own series and not get into a rut, as the Diamonds Are Forever novel is very much a straightforward, simple adventure plot that feels much more in areas like a 1950s pulp novel that you would have bought on a paperback rack in a store, especially in America, because it has a very American flavor due to it being almost entirely American set. Now, if you're not generally a reader of nonfiction works, you may think that the book might be a bit dry, but of course we are talking about actual cases of real-life diamond smuggling in the 1950s, when things were not as easy to monitor and people got really creative. But of course, this is Ian Fleming writing this, and the book does read like a Fleming novel, so it's actually quite easy to forget that Fleming Fleming wasn't just making all of this stuff up, except for the fact that Fleming actually writes prose about the interviews. He essentially made up some wonderful passages about having slightly clandestine meetings with this operative who was not going under his real name and recounting events, even though he was no longer with the IDSO and things had kind of changed in terms of how the organization was actually set up. But it's just as fun reading Fleming's fictionalized accounts of the 2 weeks of interviews that he did, and also the character in the book ostensibly takes on some of the James Bond persona. So it very much has connections to the Bond novels in terms of it's not only adjacent to Diamonds Are Forever, but the character recounting these real-life incidents is already a very Bondian character. So one can imagine this person recounting the stories to Fleming as sort of a James Bond parallel. And with the real-life person having an extensive service history in World War II and being one of the top men in MI5 for years, directly reporting to the head of MI5, and then spending years in Africa routing out diamond smugglers, there's quite a bit of Bondian elements right there. So it was natural, I think, for Fleming to, whether intentional or not, invest this work with the flavor of one of his Bond novels. And you have that combined with Fleming's incredible knack for detail and also his wry observational style. So he finds all kinds of things fascinating in these stories being told about this various group of characters in each of the stories, and how, whether it's normal people who are finally tempted beyond belief by the riches of trying to smuggle diamonds themselves, or whether it's people who are essentially wannabe diamond merchants of smuggled goods and things don't necessarily work out the way they planned, or if it's elements of a well-established diamond smuggling pipeline that the IDSO was trying to rout out, and how they had to use undercover operatives and always under the threat of mortal peril or death. So there's quite a bit of espionage tactics that are used. So all of this is within the realm of the literary Bond universe, and so it fits right in the Fleming style, and at moments you have the feeling of the Fleming sweep in terms of the actual writing, and there's a nice pace to reading this, but it is essentially split into sections that replicate the original structure of it being articles and in a newspaper, and each of the chapters is basically another story. So the book basically has Fleming writing his own internal monologue in this slightly fictionalized account of his 2 weeks of interviews with this former operative, and how they meet and kind of have to look over their shoulders a little bit and basically smoke and drink a lot while Fleming is inundated with essentially war stories of trying to stop diamond smugglers. And each chapter is basically a new story, or starts with Fleming describing basically getting up in the hotel another day to then have another series of interviews that day, and also describing the demeanor and the appearance of who he's talking with and how it was that particular day. So the book is filled with all of Fleming's descriptive touches, and you can very much visualize the locale, but it's fascinating that it's Fleming writing about himself and this real-life person that he had interviews with. So essentially, Fleming tried to keep it exciting for the reader by giving what would be otherwise fantastic tales that might be a little bit dry because they were recounting real events, by giving them the flavor of one of his James Bond novels. So I do think it was intentional, obviously, and Fleming was writing to, of course, amuse himself and also flex his creative muscles, but it makes the actual stories a bit bigger than life and gives them that that zest that Fleming had in his writing, and that's why The Diamond Smugglers is a great read. But it's fascinating to note that everything that's being recounted in the book actually did happen. It's just the actual names and dates have been changed a little bit. Other than that, every event happened as it's described, and you have Ian Fleming describing it to the reader. So of course, it's so fascinating that you don't want to put the book down. So it takes what could have been quite dry in a way outside of the subject matter and makes it so fun and engaging that you sit down and you want to read it in one sitting, just like one of the James Bond novels. So I think it is firmly tied to the Bond series. And again, at points, it even actually quotes Diamonds Are Forever, particularly even the last line, it reads better than it lives. So I think if you're reading the James Bond novels, you do really need to read The Diamond Smugglers right after you read Diamonds Are Forever, because it's obviously not a James Bond novel, but it's so directly connected to the fourth Bond novel that it's, I think, sort of like James Bond novel number 4.5, or Diamonds Are Forever 1.5. And it fits in perfectly because it's Fleming writing this in 1956, 1957, in between Diamonds Are Forever and From Russia with Love. So it's right there in his writing style of the period. So I think it needs to be looked at within the context of the time in which it was written and how it's so directly connected to Diamonds Are Forever. But just because it's a work technically of nonfiction doesn't mean that you should skip over it, because it's Fleming writing in his prime, and just as fascinating as you would expect, Ian Fleming writing about real cases of diamond smugglers actually being. It's absolutely riveting. In terms of book editions, both The Diamond Smugglers and Fleming's other nonfiction work, Thrilling Cities, have been reprinted a number of times and are relatively available. They are now also part of the modern reprints, so it's actually quite easy to get a copy. They hadn't been reprinted for quite some time before the 2010s, so for a long while it was quite difficult to get good copies. You basically had to go and search on the secondhand market for a vintage paperback. This means that there are a variety of different cover art designs, and to briefly talk about some of the cover art designs, some of them were very close to, or actually part of, the actual series designs of the James Bond paperbacks or hardcovers being done at the time. The initial hardcover editions of The Diamond Smugglers are they're good, but they are a bit on the plain side. And unfortunately for The Diamond Smugglers, most of the cover artworks are they're a bit on the plain side. That's the best way to describe them. The best of them, I think, have that sort of Bondian flavor. So the covers for the UK pan paperbacks are really wonderful because they have the aesthetic of the British pan paperbacks of the Bond novels. So they actually fit in and make a nice set with the Bond novels. And then, of course, we also have the more modern reprintings, such as the Thomas and Mercer editions, the Vintage Classics editions, and now even the Ian Fleming Publications editions. All of these are done to match the design of the other Bond novels, so they are again part of the overall set if you get all of them. And thankfully, it seems that both the American and British new editions of both Thrilling Cities and The Diamond Smugglers do not have any edits or censoring done to them, although I don't know what they would exactly find objectionable, but at least they do seem to be untouched, and so thankfully you can actually look at the modern in-print editions and not have to worry about any changed text. But in terms of my favorite edition and what I think has the best cover artwork and design, and the version I have in my collection, it's actually the US 1960s paperback from Dell. And as you can see, they very obviously tried to follow the iconic Signet paperbacks of the 60s. So here is my Signet of Diamonds Are Forever held alongside, and as you can see, they tried to copy it as much as humanly possible. Even the way Fleming's name is done, the actual font layout, and the fact that the title's on the bottom and we have a really nice bit of painted artwork in between the text. But on this, it's actually quite a lot bigger and nicely done. The spines are even very similar, and the rear covers are very similar, using a similar very close black and white photo of Fleming on the Dell edition. So I basically look at this as like a pretend Signet James Bond novel, and it also goes nicely on the shelf because it's the same size. So almost the same size. It's just a little bit taller. The only other major difference is, like most Dell paperbacks, this has green edged pages instead of the iconic red of the Signets. But if you're going to get any printed copy of the Diamond Smugglers, and especially if you prefer vintage editions and you want one that will have the James Bond flavor and match your vintage Bond editions, I think the US Dell paperback, this is from 1965, I think this is the one to go for. And it's usually quite affordable. It doesn't cost more than usually $5 to $10 for a nice copy. So the Diamond Smugglers is unfortunately sort of glossed over. And again, I think it's a very important work in terms of the development of Fleming as a writer. And it's beyond fascinating to see him give his own flair and the Bondian touch to real life stories being recounted by a real life person who himself was quite Bondian. So it gives a particular zest and sparkle to real life stories of diamond smuggling. And of course, Fleming could enliven most anything, but when you have such already fantastical stories of people getting involved in illicit diamond trading, it's great when you have a writer like Fleming to not dramatize, but give a sense of drama to stories that are already dramatic in and of themselves. So the book reads just like a James Bond novel in terms of having some of the Fleming sweep and having his beautiful wit and observational style, but it's still recounting stories of actual cases of smuggling. So it does kind of balance between being an account of real life incidents and having the flavor of a Bond novel. So it's the Bondian flavor that makes the real life accounts actually more enjoyable to sit down and read, and you just go from one chapter to the next and you can read the whole book in one sitting, whereas otherwise it probably would be a bit dry and in spite of the subject matter, and it probably wouldn't be a book that you'd sit down and enjoy reading in one sitting. It might be one that you read a chapter at a time. So again, it's Fleming's sparkle and his wit that keeps you invested in reading chapter after chapter. I also think, interestingly, the idea of Fleming writing about having an interview, and then the book being the author's version of the account he was told by this person. Basically, the author turning the interview and the interview experience into prose form. That's actually a precedent, I think, that's set, because if you're a James Bond fan, it should sound quite familiar to another work, which of course is John Pearson's authorized biography of James Bond, which had the central conceit of what if James Bond, in terms of the literary character, was actually a real person and Ian Fleming had merely written fictionalized accounts of the real James Bond's adventures, and what would James Bond be like now as a much older man, recounting his experiences that now the world had some version of in the wildly popular novels, and how would he react to that? And it's one of the great works of the later non-Fleming James Bond books, but it's got a central conceit that I think builds on what you see in the Diamond Smugglers. So every time I read this, I can't help but think of the authorized James Bond biography, and how I don't know if there was a direct inspiration, but it seems like there might have been, because I'm sure Pearson was obviously aware of the Diamond Smugglers, and maybe that gave him the idea, or maybe it was some sort of inspiration. But if you're a fan of that sort of conceit, or if you've read the authorized biography of James Bond, the Diamond Smugglers will feel very similar, because it's a similar sort of idea, but it's actually about real life events that were recounted by the real operative, but the names were just fictionalized. Everything else was actually real. So ultimately, I think the Diamond Smugglers needs to be considered as an unofficial part of the James Bond book series. It is very much tied to the Diamonds Are Forever novel, as the entire reason for its being was generated out of Fleming's intensive research for that book. And again, the Diamond Smugglers actually does quote the Diamonds Are Forever novel on at least several occasions. So I think it's important to have slotted in between Diamonds and From Russia with Love in terms of the overall chronology, because that's when it was written, and it in some ways is a continuation of a lot of the themes of Diamonds Are Forever, and it gives you more of the real-life context that Fleming was drawing on his intensive research to generate the Diamonds Are Forever novel. So if you're reading the books and you're a diehard Fleming fan and you love to analyze the James Bond character and the literary Bond, I think The Diamond Smugglers is an absolute must. And so when I read through the books, I think I'm going to continue doing this of reading The Diamond Smugglers in between Diamonds Are Forever and From Russia with Love, as it is so closely tied to the book Bond that I think it's in a lot of ways a sort of unofficial quasi-James Bond novel, even though it wasn't intended to be seen that way. So as always, I hope my babblings about the world of James Bond, Ian Fleming, and Fleming's other writings has been at least somewhat fun and informative. It's not often that you see Fleming's non-Bond works discussed. Obviously, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang has a life of its own as a beloved children's novel, but the two technically nonfiction works of The Diamond Smugglers and Thrilling Cities often get overlooked, and while they are reprinted sometimes as part of a Bond reprint series, that's not always the case. So thankfully they're back in print now, but there's no telling if they're going to then go back out of print. So it's not often that you actually get to talk about these other works, and I think a lot of Bond fans haven't even read the nonfiction works. So part of the reason why I wanted to cover this is because I do think The Diamond Smugglers is so incredibly important. I mean, all of Fleming's writing is, but I think this work in particular has such a Bond connection and actually grew out of one of the Bond novels that I think it's important to read in the chronology of Fleming's writing in between Bond novels. So if you haven't read it before, I strongly urge you to do so. I think it's important for all Bond fans to read The Diamond Smugglers, especially if you love the Diamonds Are Forever novel. Again, it is currently available in the modern reprints, which you can find in both print and ebook form, or you can hopefully support your local independent bookstore by hopefully being able to pick either a new copy up or find a lovely vintage edition. And again, I would suggest tracking down the lovely Dell edition that's the sort of quasi-signet ripoff that I find so endearing. But as always, keep the James Bond flag flying, keep reading print books, keep bonding, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching. So I think Fleming was wise to try... There had to be a loud car when I'm trying to do this. There just had to be a loud car. You please leave, you irritating man! Da 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 da. Waiting for the annoying loud car to leave the driveway next door. Trying to fit this in the background music for the White House Casino.